Hey everybody, DJ Lou here, and up next is sexy topic of copyright. Copyright is definitely a very complex subject. It's just layered in different laws from all the way back in the 1700s all the way to just even this year when new law was passed. And you'll see some people with just a little nugget of information and kind of try to apply that globally. Some people really just don't know at all. And let's try to clear the fog out of this a little bit. Let's look back to the past. Let's see how we even got here. And how this applies to DJs and what we need to be aware of to try to accomplish what we're trying to do. Now, a quick preface on this, I am no legal scholar. There's no degree behind me or anything like that. But that being said, I started really kind of being interested in copyright back into the very early 90s when I was still in high school. I wrote a paper on this, and I've always kind of kept track on this. I keep abreast on a lot of the legal challenges that are going on. And so while I am definitely no legal scholar, and please do not treat this as gospel, and things change, by the time that this video gets out there after a couple of years, things could definitely change with new legal precedent and whatnot. That being said, I'm hoping that this comes off as a well-informed piece. I've tried to do a lot of research. Some of this is going to be quite boring because I'm going to be diving into historical aspects. But I think a lot of this really sets the foundation so we know what we can do as a DJ. So let's go back to 1790 where this all starts with federal copyright law. Prior to that, you did have some state laws and common law that kind of went in play, but there was nothing codified. There was no international law that applied or anything like that. Then in 1790, the very first federal copyright law went into place. This was to be an encouragement of learning. This provided a limited monopoly for authors to be able to profit off of this, but eventually it would go into the public domain. And in this first iteration in 1790, it was 14 years. And then if the author so wished, they could apply for another 14 years. So it wasn't until 1831 and the first bit of copyright law that applied to music went into play. And also in 1831, you had a 28-year automatic first round of copyright, plus you could apply for another 14 years after that. And then another 78 years later, in 1909, the copyright law was retooled where it would give you 56 years of total copyright. That'd be 28 years initially and then 28 years extended. So the reason I started going that far back is because in 1877, the music industry essentially started. You started to see cylinders being created, rude and crude forms of records started coming out. And then ultimately in 1901, you started seeing a little bit more coalescing of things. You started seeing celebrities, putting their voices onto these recordings. And the popularity grew and grew. And then in 1945 is when the music industry truly started taking shape as we know it today. Magnetic tape ended up being invented, and this truly transformed the industry. And all during this time, you had rock, you had pop, you had soul, you had country. All these genres started to mold and take shape. But during this entire time, the Copyright Act had not changed. It actually wasn't until 1971 with the Sounds Recording Act where music as a recording element of it was finally codified into law. So prior to this, the closest you came to was compositions on sheets. But now, starting in 1971, copyright truly extended to recordings on different kinds of media. So let's fast forward to 1976, and this is truly where music, copyright, and law really changed completely. The Copyright Act of 1976 is finally signed in, and there's some good and some bad in this. The copyright terms go absolutely insane in my opinion. They now cover the lifetime of the author plus 50 years after. Now, one positive thing that come out of this was the Declaration of Fair Use, and Congress declared that those 4 elements, fairly narrow, educational, critique, some transformative elements and whatnot, but there was finally into law where there were aspects of copyright that could be used for the public gain and public interest. Now, some people think that they could just take samples and just put it on their videos. That is not what this covers, but fair use definitely helped solidify this idea that some bits of copyright music could be used in some works and not be subject to license. Now, one reason for the Copyright Act of 1976 and some of the precedent that happens afterwards is because of RIA, the Recording Industry Association of America. And this is a behemoth of an industry. They incorporated what's now just the big few that are left, but essentially every major label and all that were associated with RIA. And they really kind of took this very aggressive and anti-consumer approach, even from the early days. Everything from even when cassette tapes were out, they were, especially like in the UK as well, but even in the US, they were going on anti-cassette tape campaigns. Recording at home is theft and all this stuff. When hard drives became a thing, basically, like in Canada, they helped to impose taxes up there for that. In the US, CD taxes, they tried a tape tax. They just kept on this idea that as long as it wasn't under their control, they wanted no part of it. And luckily in 1992, Congress did come up with the Audio Home Recording Act. It was already there kind of in law, but this really kind of codified that very clearly, that both digital and analog recordings were allowed by us consumers. So everything from backing up music, making your own personal mixtapes, all this was covered within this. Now, when I say your own personal mixtapes, also does not mean that you could just go sell it out on the street or anything like that. That is a violation of copyright. But if you're making your own stuff, you're making your own backups, you have the original sources, this is something that this law helps protect. Now, this didn't stop RIA as new technologies were starting to form, like mini disc and digital audio tape. They made sure that they put their fingers into it. They really pressured the industry to put in elements to help protect their assets, in this case, SCMS, which is Serial Copy Management System. And essentially what this did, it allowed the degradation of digital copies. So you couldn't have these multi-generational copies be as clean as the first. So even though RIA had their fingers on the industry people to try to keep things at bay on that side, the consumer side ultimately were not having it. Once you started seeing MP3s really start to take foothold, once you started seeing the MP3 player come into play, from everything from just being able to play on your computer to Diamond creating their portable MP3 player, Apple ultimately with the iPod, they really just did not have the tools to combat this. File sharing just became rampant. And it most likely ruined an entire generation of people who were at one point, just like me, I used to collect vinyl, I used to have CDs on the side, and people started turning to these free sources. I mean, free music and just a massive catalog of music as well. You had artists like Metallica trying to go after consumers. You had RIA themselves going after consumers. But just it was a real hodgepodge of stuff, and they really couldn't stymie the tide of this just massive wave of consumers wanting this type of material. RIA even happened to go after Diamond, who created the first portable MP3 player, saying because they didn't use SCMS that it was in violation of law, but the courts came back that these files were technically not music files per se. They were just regular files, and they weren't subject to this law. That just kind of put RIA back on their heels, because they didn't have the tools at this point to try to combat, again, all the file sharing, people wanting to go digital. The consumers at this point truly dictated what the markets were finally starting to do, as opposed to the RIA really having control of the entire process. So in 1997, there was another act called the NET Act, the No Electronic Theft Act. And you just got to love these names. And this really kind of went after the file sharers and really put this framework in where in the past, in order to violate the law, you had to profit from it. And now that was no longer applicable. So if you were giving music away for free, whether it was file sharing or just, through other means, no longer was that protected. And while RIA was unsuccessful going after Diamond and the MP3 player, they did go after the file sharing services. LimeWire, for instance, they claimed $72 trillion of damages, which is an impossibility. They just went for the gusto. They had, if I'm not mistaken, it was $150,000 per instance of copyright infringement, and you take that by the millions and millions of songs. $72 trillion. Ultimately, it was around $105 million that LimeWire did have to pay for this infringement. And this really started the collapse of the file sharing services, again, BearShare, Napster, and whatnot. They had no legal standing to combat RIA. Ultimately, RIA and some of the artists did stop attacking consumers directly. There were a few very high-profile cases. Some mothers of students who happen to have a program on their computer. Next thing you know, naturally, it used to share out music, and they would be sued for it. Most of these cases were not one. I do believe that there were a couple that were, but ultimately, the RIA was fighting both a lost cause legally and also in the PR sense. Now, come 1998, RIA definitely struck gold with the passage of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA. Still wreaks havoc on us today. And part of that is because, one, fair use ended up being under attack because they would put in copyright protections on the media itself. And if you circumvented it, it would be against the law. You saw this especially with like DVDs. So talking out of music for a second, but the MPAA put these protections in there, so you could no longer legally back up your stuff, and the courts would side with against the consumers in this fashion. So things like fair use truly no longer held nearly as much value in the courts as it once did. And this also gave the tools to RIA, the MPAA, and others to go after ISPs. Even though there was a safe harbor clause in there, they were really forcing the ISPs, YouTube, Facebook, and others to police the content. And this really put a lot of technology companies, in very precarious situations because, this is an enormously expensive issue to take on, and it essentially gave RIA and others just incredible power to go after a gamut of people. Now, also in 1998, you saw the passage of the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Act, really kind of focused from Disney to push copyright even further. Mickey Mouse was about to go into the public domain, and they lobbied Congress successfully to change laws. Now it's now the lifetime of the author plus 70 years, or if you're a corporate entity, 120 years from initial creation, or 95 years after it was released to the public. So the whole purpose of copyright, this originally 14 years plus 14 years, we're now turning into an in perpetuity cause, and this really became a cause of alarm for a lot of people, even in the industry that are artists and whatnot, saw that this was, while somewhat beneficial to them, they could also see the negative aspects of not having material get out there into the public domain. All right, let's go way back to the 1800s again and the right of first sale. This ultimately wasn't challenged in the courts until 1908, when somebody had a novel, wanted to sell it, and the courts ultimately decided that yes, if you are a consumer, you buy this original media, you have the ability to sell it. So now this did extend to CDs, records, and cassette tapes, again, as long as they're the originals. But unfortunately, the right of first sale does not extend to digital media. So they basically were trying to create this store that if you had a digital file, you'll be able to upload it and sell it, at least make some money from your original purchase. But because this was again, not, it was music, but it was a digital file, that the right of first sale did not apply because this was a different form of media. This was not an original per se, and the court just ultimately said, nope, no right of first sale for digital files. So you cannot resell an iTunes song, an Amazon song back to somebody, is just not covered under law. Now we got 2018 and the MMA that just recently got passed, and probably the biggest thing in this is the Classics Act. And basically, anything prior to 1972 only had this kind of quasi copyright applied. This is no longer the case. They are now protected. Now, with this, unfortunately, I think it's 2068 before the first, what we would consider modern music, is going to be in the public domain. So there's still a tremendous time before the intent of copyright to have this material hit the public domain will ever hit the public domain. So there was some positives in the effect that artists now have a clearinghouse of royalties now kind of codified into law, so that is a good thing. But again, some good and some bad that came out of this law. Now, I could talk ad nauseum on licensing. It is even more complex than copyright. Basically, when we boil this down to, there are different kinds of licensing depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So everything from the master use right, the mechanical license, synchronization license, permissions to arrange, pre-production rights, all these different things have to be in play for certain things, like if you're creating a mixtape and trying to give it to somebody, if you want to broadcast out on Facebook. There are some services out there that cover some of these and make it a lot easier, but if you try to do this purely from I want to make a mixtape and put it out there, there's a lot of things, a lot of process, and it typically becomes prohibitively expensive to try to do. But just be aware that to legally do a lot of things that ultimately hit the public or hit a consumer, there is one or more licenses that need to be attached to make it legal. So now let's talk about public performance versus private performance. Again, a highly contested and confusing subject, partly due because there isn't a lot of law that has been established to really clearly define what is and what's not. And if you ever notice in your terms of service, Spotify, iTunes, and whatnot, they clearly state that this isn't supposed to be used for a public performance. Well, what is a public performance? What is a private performance? Now, I posted the entire legalese behind this on my blog. Go check that out. But when you really kind of break this down, it seems that a private event typically is 10 people, 20 people, even less. Even a wedding, which is technically a private event, as soon as you start getting into the chain of a friend or, a cousin, somebody that's not immediate, this is no longer, unfortunately, a private event. Now, venues, at least most legit venues, will just simply apply, their license for public into the private side because, it's covered. They don't have anything else to worry about. But in the grand scheme of things, the public performance is pretty much, for a DJ's perspective, always in play. So, and while we don't have to worry directly about licensing, unless we are a promoter, let's say you're doing like a street party or something like that, and you're the head of that promotion, then yes, you are legally bound to get that proper licensing. But for performing at a wedding, performing at a public or private event, a club or whatnot, it is the venue's responsibility to obtain this license. Now, other countries are different. Some of the DJs do have to be burdened by those licenses, but here in the U.S., that is not the case. So if you ever get that, that you're responsible for license clause that you would see from somebody, be very worried, because they're basically trying to put the promotion aspect on this onto you, and you don't want to have to be burned by those licenses. All right, I know that was not as sexy as I had initially claimed. This is a very complex, legalese, boring subject in a lot of cases. If you went through all that, kudos to you. I truly appreciate you watching the video at this point. But let's get into a Q&A. Let's try to get some real-world scenarios here. Let's apply what we now know between the old laws of copyright, some of the additional acts, and see where we're at in all this as a DJ. So as a DJ, do I need a license to play in the US? No. Unless you are the promoter of an event, the venue owner, or by some shady tactic, the venue is trying to pass this all off to you or a coordinator or something like that, which you do pretty much do not want to get into this quagmire of licensing. No, in the US, you do not. Other countries, you do have to, not all of them, of course, but in the US, you do not. Am I a copyright holder? So if I buy one of these records, I just get to do whatever I want with this? No. You are being licensed for that copy for specific playback in certain circumstances. So yes, I can go take those records. I can take my CDs. I can go play in an event. I can take my digital files. I can play those in an event. Again, the venue's covering the aspect of the licensing in that regard, but I cannot take this material and make a mixtape and go sell it legally. Is just not in the cards. Can I resell a CD, an LP, a cassette tape? Yes, you can. The right of first sale allows that to happen. Can I resell digital music? A pool file, a iTunes song? No, you cannot. Again, Capitol versus Redigi. This is not considered music per se. This is something a little different. It's quasi, again, legalese we're talking here, but you cannot resell a digital file. Is it legal for me to back up my music? Absolutely. You can. The Home Recording Act, again, codifies that into law. What you do after that, it depends what you're doing with it. But for backing up, absolutely. Can I legally rip a CD from a library? Unfortunately, you cannot. You did not buy that material. It's not there for you to legally back up or make a copy for yourself. Can I sell a hard drive full of digital music? Again, see that lawsuit with Capitol. You cannot. Can I ever give a client a copy of my performance? No, you cannot, unless you obtain the proper licensing. I can already tell you that'd be so cost prohibitive, especially you're probably playing for an assortment of labels, not just one. So you'd have to get, each one, all those clear. You have to get, additional licensing essentially to make a quote unquote mixtape type of license, an arrangement license. Yeah, you just don't want to go down this quagmire. It is technically there, feasibly, absolutely not. So why does Facebook and others block my live streams or some of my uploads? Well, again, this is the DMCA in play. The RIA and all the industry has this ability to force these properties to be the content police. Is it fair? Again, personally, I don't think so. But in the end, this is where the legal aspects of this run. So Facebook does not want to get sued. So they do fingerprint these songs. And, with the exception of, some songs that they've, worked out deals with, they just do not want to deal with the headaches of a lawsuit. So can I put a mixtape up on Mixcloud or some other services legally? Now, this is a bit of a gray area. Let's talk about Mixcloud specifically for a second. They're UK-based. They have UK laws that are a little bit more generous in this case. They have signed deals with UMG and WMG. It seems that there is from a legalese standpoint, the clearest path for a DJ like us to be able to put something up there, not having to take it down. The artists are actually getting compensated for it. It's about as legal as it can get for now. That being said, there hasn't been any direct challenges against them. Just because they exist does not mean that it's legal. Make that perfectly clear. There have been many record pools that got ultimately taken down because they didn't have the proper licensing. Again, services out in the cloud. They were up. They got taken down when they got too big and they got challenged. But from can I do this? Maybe. I wish I could give you a definitive answer. It definitely does seem to be the most legal from the options that are out there right now. So what's the legality of services like Spotify, Tidal, and SoundCloud being integrated into DJ applications like Serato? Now, I don't know if you remember Pulse from a few years ago. They were integrated in Serato as well. They ultimately got pulled. It is rumored that a lot of it was because of licensing deals. Again, you have this whole issue of public performance versus private performance. What are these deals that they're inking with services like Tidal? Does Tidal, even beyond some of the limited catalog that they do have direct access to, they're also offering access to a wider part of the catalog. So again, just because a service exists does not mean that it's 100% on the legal up and up. If it truly got challenged in court, if just say the labels got upset one day and decided to pull the plug, that's it. You can't use these services. And I have a whole article on why you should own your own catalog and operate on that. I'll throw the link below on that. Again, this is kind of an unknown thing. There isn't any true legal precedent of between the DMCA, between the way the deals are inked, public versus private performance, how this kind of all goes into play. All that being said, it does seem that the record industry knows that digital is just a way of life now. They've inked deals with Spotify and others for their streaming. From a consumer side, the real interesting aspect is from the DJ side. We are profiting off of playing back music. There is a much different legal framework behind that versus just a consumer listening to it. Then that's why you see in these terms of services where this whole again public versus private side of the equation within it. All that being said, all you can really do is use your best judgment in that regard. Don't be surprised if services just come and go, or that you just get yanked one day. Definitely don't be surprised. Now, I mix my personal feelings in a little bit on this, but this is definitely my commentary corner in this. The RIA as a whole has not been a good steward in this entire process from a consumer side, and even the DJ side. Go back to the anti-tape days, even reel-to-reels they had problems with, CDRs, the digital playback devices like the Diamond RIA, Apple iPod. It took forever for services like Apple to legitimately be able to sell digital music, and then they rather go after users and ISPs and other services other than providing what the consumers want. So from my personal perspective, I've never been much of a fan of RIA. And the consumers have spoken over the years. There was a very high trend of music purchasing and consumption, especially with the advent of CDs. That precipitously fell. And now you are starting to see a little bit of a comeback, especially with vinyl. Vinyl has made somewhat of a resurgence. This is nothing like it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago in its heydays. The fact that with vinyl resurging makes a big bump in RIA sales actually speaks to how much it's declined. If you look at the charts, it's very significant. And on copyright length, I've already kind of made my ideas known on this, but originally it was supposed to be a short term of a monopoly for a copyright holder to be able to profit off of it. Again, the original was 14 years plus 14. Now it's lifetime plus 70 years, 95 to 120 on the corporate side. The whole purpose of having things hit the public domain was a thing. This was the whole purpose of this, and that has definitely gone by the wayside, where companies are definitely holding the purse strings on this. So as for the DJ specifically, things have changed. I used to lug crates back in the late 80s and the 90s, switching to CDs. This is a digital world now, and clients, especially for me as a wedding DJ, a client would like to hear what I generally sound like, at least my transitional styles, my mixing style. They want a sample of that. So I put my stuff on Mixcloud. It is a legal gray area. I don't think personally individuals are going to get attacked like they did in the past. And even then it was a very, very small percentage. But the legal framework was there to be attacked. It still is there, especially with the DMCA, the copyright extensions and whatnot. There is a legal quagmire that if for some reason you got targeted, you are on the defensive side of this. There isn't a whole lot of ground to stand on. I really do hope that things are changing for the better. You do see that these deals being inked with Facebook, with YouTube, Tidal and SoundCloud with Serato and all that. I'm hoping that this is a positive trend going forward. Is it perfect? No. There's nothing specific in law that protects the DJ directly. Again, you're having to deal with all these different acts over the years that have been passed. Certain things will work in certain degrees, other things will not. Streaming is much different than throwing up a mixtape. Again, different licensing, different laws. There's a lot of things to consider. Ultimately, I would love to see a framework change where even if it came down to DJs having to have, to purchase a license to be able to do, say, streaming or whatnot, if it's reasonable, I'll personally pay it because, again, it's a powerful marketing tool for the DJ. Do I think that's going to happen? I really do doubt it. The DJing aspect in this is a very small piece of the puzzle in the large consumer side. So from RIA's perspective, they're not really caring about us much. Even the very large acts that do put material out there, they could definitely, and I've seen them do it. I've seen them stream popular music on a mix, on a live stream on, say, Facebook. Sometimes people get away with it, some people don't. And there seems to be not a lot of true weighing of, why is this legal? Why is this not? Is it because this person's popular? Is it because of certain songs? There's just no framework for it. And I really wish that framework was more visible and out in the open so people could just kind of figure things out. But I hope that with everything that was shown in this video, that this kind of gives you at least a better framework of what's legal, what's quasi-legal, what's definitely not legal, and you come out at least a little better informed. Well, there's the video, and I hope you liked it. And if so, click that thumbs up, hit subscribe, ding that notification bell, do whatever social media is telling you to do right now. And if you like this video, go ahead, check out the 4 DJs Only playlist for more.